projections are often considered dystopian. Why does SF focus on tech and superficial change more than deep sociological change? Is it harder to see how people and societies change than how gadgets do? I have an immediate question for the panel about that, but first I'd like to invite the members of the panel to introduce themselves, and then I'll toss the question out, and I suspect that will take us happily through our remaining time. So, Rob, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Robert Killheffer. I long-time attender of Readercon and editor, writer, critic, reviewer for 25 years or so. Worked at Omni, did my own magazine called Century for a while. Worked with Ellen Datlow again at Event Horizon at Web Magazine some years back. And just all around science fiction fan type guy.
Hi, LJ Cohen, all-around geek, sci-fi fan. Started watching Doctor Who during the Watergate hearings. Truth. Science fiction and fantasy novelist, and have some strong opinions about this panel.
Now I'm struck by an image of a portal opening up above Sam Rollins at the Watergate hearings. So, anyway.
You know, it could have been so much better.
I'm Elsa Sjunneson-Henry. I'm a genre writer. I do some occasional poking of people at Fireside, and I'm also a disability advocate, which might be why I'm on this panel, maybe.
So I'm Sidorova. I am a scientist by sort of day job, molecular biologist, molecular and cellular biology, and I also write sort of science fiction and fantasy, historical fantasy, kind of, yeah. And my novel published The Device in 2015, and I have some short stories out and coming. I don't know why I'm on that panel.
You were available at 9 p.m. on Thursday.
I guess, yeah, but the accent, I'm also of Russian sort of extraction, so maybe, yeah, I'm adding the otherness flavor in this one.
Thanks. And I guess I should say, again, I'm Brad Cox. I'm a professor of English at Norwich University in Vermont. I write fiction because mostly short stories, because the fame and fortune of writing short stories was too much to bear. I've recently started writing poetry. And I've been coming to Readercon for a long time, even before my wife and I moved to New England. All right, my immediate question is, if the premise is, does science fiction ignore social change in favor of technological change, my immediate question is, well, does it? Because well, I'll just leave it at that. And since we ended here, why don't we pick up back here? And that would be my first question, would be to kind of interrogate the premise of the panel. Do you think that panel description is accurate? Does science fiction, do a better job with technological change than with social change, or does it in fact ignore social change?
Yeah, it's big sort of hard question. I would lean towards, doesn't necessarily ignore, but it might just be easier indeed to speculate about technological change than about sort of social changes. And there are sort of, again, multitude of reasons for that probably. And one, of course, the science fiction was born as indeed fiction about science, right? So perhaps the 19th century before, it was really kind of very, if you will, progress, rational human, reaching the moon and the stars oriented. And that was a particular type of human that did all that reaching, I suppose. And so a particular type of human wrote about it, about people like himself sort of reaching. And yet, at the same time, you could say that for social change, even though, yes, we do, I mean, some people would argue that that sort of as a human nature has not changed really. So the only thing that changed is technology. So you might as well just kind of leave that by default, human nature, and sort of describe technology. Probably just harder to predict. again, at the 19th century, the age of, conveyor belt factories, right? Things assembled from parts. Movements of people who assemble these things were attempted to be sort of broken into little sort of kind of motion bits and pieces. Technology seemed to be robotic, and so robots, of course, right, artificial beings have dominated science fiction. So it gave really the impetus that probably lingers still now. Now we are actually facing a totally different kind of projection that might not be right, but it certainly will populate us. That is, of course, networks, everything is connectivity. Anyway, I think I'm probably taking too much time, right? But in brief, and we could go more and more about it, is social change is harder, more unpredictable. I would kind of throw to the panel, maybe for further discussion, that we are in the middle of huge social changes that we are probably not even beginning to touch in terms of actually writing. So, and we don't know where it will lead us.
So yes, it does. But I believe it depends on the kind of society or groups that we're talking about. For example, queer change is something that I find wasn't written about. Change for women is something that hasn't been written about, and change for people with disabilities. It's very rare to see disabled characters in fiction making change in a way that's positive and in a way that is divorced from technology, which is, I think, really important here. The technology is often used to force disabled people to conform to society, rather than society conforming to changing disability identity. So what ends up happening is that you don't see disability once the future hits. That's sort of why I think that it's being ignored, because it's not actually being seen. And I think that that happens with women as well. I think it happens with any queer identities, certainly.
I actually do disagree with the premise of the panel, and I think that's why they put me on the panel, because I had said that in my comments. If you look at some of the sort of seminal works of science fiction, like The Left Hand of Darkness, that's a book about ideas about gender that couldn't be further from whiz-bang technology, because it really did interrogate how we look at our own construct of gender in society. And there are a host of other examples just like that. I think that speculative fiction as a whole, and science fiction in particular, can really turn a lens on current society without it seeming to do so. So for me, it's the ultimate in stealth literature, so that you can throw in faster than light travel, and you can throw in wormholes and whiz-bang technology. But at the heart of it, it's looking at how society interacts with both the technology and fellow beings. I also think that first contact literature is also a place where you're really interrogating social change through the lens of looking at the other. So I think that the technology is not so much a distraction from the social issues, but a way of presenting them so that it gets in, so that it's exciting and fun to read.
Yeah, I guess I would come down at least as far in questioning the premise as you are at. Because one thing I would do is look at the first sentence, because I don't think that the idea that science fiction is inherently predictive, or tries to be, is really that accurate in either of the realms. I don't think that, so prediction is kind of the wrong way to look at it. It may be true that there's more and easier adoption of playing around with crazy technical ideas, but they're not predictive. Very little of what science fiction's classic technologies have come to pass, and a lot of things that have come to pass have been totally missed. So if you look at it from a predictive level, I don't think it does a good job in either case. As you said, though, it has actually addressed many social issues all through its history. you can go back to H.G. Wells, who was every bit as interested in social change, socialism, free love, ideas that were floating around in his time as he was in any of the technical stuff, and more so. And he very much focused, something like War of the Worlds is not about an alien invasion so much as he makes it very clear in the beginning, it's a critique of the imperial British program, very much with what they did the Tasmanians in mind. He mentioned specifically on the first 2 pages. So that's the kind of thing which started in the very beginning and has always gone on, where what may be missing, what may have sparked the panel idea is more what Elsa was saying, which is that it hasn't done very much about presenting the ideas explicitly. So a lot of the work looking at sexuality and gender has gone with things like Aliens, The Left Hand of Darkness, and so forth, where we push the structures out onto a different species or a different culture, and then look at it that way with the clear implication of criticizing or looking at our own habits. But so it may be that what's noticed as being missing is a direct approach to trying to present a view of sort of a relatively near future where certain specific things in our current society might have changed. And that definitely is not something that I think people do a lot. Why? Because it's hard, and also it's the same in tech. I mean, people don't seem to be inspired to try to write stories about, like, I want to accurately predict what cars are like in 10 years. So they mostly missed, right? Like, you don't have a very good science fiction representations of cars as they are today, because no one sat around and said, well, that's what I care about most in the story is I want to nail it. I want to get airbags, the hind view camera, I want to have that. The rest of the story, you care, like I'll make up some characters and do it. I want to make sure I can get GM's plans. And this is kind of the same when it comes to social stuff, I think, is that they're not usually looking at what's right about to occur and trying to nail it exactly, like what's the discussion going to be like about this subject. But it might be something to try. It's not to say that it shouldn't be done, it's just that may be the gap that's being pointed at here.
Now, having thoroughly trashed the premise of the panel, I want to come back and return to it and somewhat defend it. And Elsa, I'd like to turn back to you because I was thinking what you were saying about that groups of people and areas of life that you don't see represented. And I'm wondering if part of the issue is maybe not so much that science fiction ignores the very idea of sociological change, but that when it does represent sociological change, it presents it through, I don't know what the term would be, a normative perspective, a kind of,
normative.
would be so that we know things are going to be different and people are going to be behaving differently within society, but maybe there aren't enough examples of them really, as Rob was saying, showing that directly. Or maybe the very few examples that are there just kind of point out the lack of a larger number.
So I guess I'm kind of going to take that and shift just slightly, because there was a point that I wanted to take from you and move slightly to the left with it. What are cars going to look like in 10 years? Well, hopefully they'll all be self-driving, says the blind woman who can't use a car. So one of the questions that I think about is, why aren't we looking at things from the perspective of how society will change drastically to include more people? That's kind of what I see from the future stuff that's missing. So the normative lens of this is how it is now, I think does play out in a lot of science fiction. These are the people you don't see out because they don't have access to this kind of technology. But what if you did write a near future story in which people with disabilities had complete inclusion because of the way that they access transit or the way that you access communications? It breaks things open. So I guess that it also changes the way that women's work functions. We were just talking about this at dinner. If these things change, then the actual structure of society changes. So I don't see the near future stuff sort of acknowledging those larger societal shifts that could occur. That's why I kind of felt that I agreed with this panel, is because that's more of what I see not existing, is those acknowledgments of small things that you tweak just one tiny thing, which to me might be big, but, and then it completely radically changes the whole structure of one group.
Or may I venture, maybe one way to think of it is that they're not really looked at, not really mentioned, or maybe they're actually already kind of, oh yes, we've got all that, and now we could move on, and
Right.
it's already solved. So it's not even dissected the way it perhaps should be.
Well, because in cyberpunk, it's like, oh, we already have all these augmentations,
That's
we don't
right.
have
Yeah,
to deal
we're
with it.
already- Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or everybody's in the workplace already, or what have you.
Right, I think that's
Yeah.
something that I think goes back to the origins of SF and like the vision of the future, is that up until fairly recently, it was kind of, it seemed like in many quarters, it was a sort of assumption, like you're saying, that one thing about the future, if it was a positive future, would be that we would kind of gotten over a bunch of things that are a problem now, and so it skips, it didn't necessarily mean to suggest that it wasn't important, but it said, I'm looking forward to the idea that this won't be an issue, so there hasn't been enough attention to, what is it, how are we really gonna get there? Kind of move on to 100 years from now and say, you know, and that seemed like a little bit of the vision, sort of the Star Trek kind of vision, right? It'd be like, you know, it's gonna be the same kind of organizations, it's just everybody of every nationality and color will be able to be there, and we just assume that. We don't, thereby we kind of avoid having to talk about it.
Yeah, the future will be much like the present, except that everything will work.
Yeah. It's kind of like, yeah, there's no racism. Where?
Right.
There's no
Well,
racism.
Oh, there's no-
Right?
Because
Yeah.
if we could write that piece, that missing piece, then we could solve the problem. Clearly, we haven't figured that out as a people, so we just sort of skip over it and play a little hand wavium and figure out that in 50 years it'll all be fixed.
But it's a noble vision, right? It's a very, what if we were to sort of take one more step and say, okay, all right, so we have all that. Could we even fantasize what next problems could emerge from that? Would they be problems or good things, bad things? What would come next? I mean, I can't even fathom.
Right, it's like Theodore Sturgeon's famous line about always ask the next question. And I'm also thinking about, was Heinlein probably, who said that, you know, writing a story in the late 19th century, predicting the automobile is no big deal. You know, predicting the freeway system is a little bit better, but still kind of comes with the territory. Predicting the traffic jam is even better, but the real trick is to predict not only the drive-in movie, but the change in dating patterns that will happen as a result of the drive-in movie.
Or road rage.
Or road rage, yeah. But even that, all those examples I've just given, you know, to get back to your point, are still within a very kind of general perspective and maybe aren't taking it even further to consider. You know, maybe you're imagining the change in dating patterns, but you're still thinking about exclusively heterosexual couples who are there in the cars, right? So, so there's always seems to be a challenge to take it to the next step. One thing, sort of putting on my English teacher's hat, I guess, is there, I would ask, and anybody just jump in with this, can you think of a work of science fiction? You already mentioned The Left Hand of Darkness, and you mentioned The War of the Worlds. Are there any works of science fiction, classic, contemporary, or otherwise, that you would point to as examples of work that really does the sort of work that this is doing, something that does successfully what this
So there's
challenging?
the Vorgosigan novels,
That's what I was
Joel
gonna bring up.
books.
I love
I
Miles so
love
much.
Miles. Miles is badass. He's like my favorite character. She does some really interesting things with sociology. For one thing, there are uterine replicators, so women do not have to be pregnant and give birth. That completely changes parenting for both parents, and many, many other things. And she talks about some of those. She presents a culture where there are hermaphroditic people. So, and there's a character who's a hermaphrodite in the book, and he's equally attracted, sometimes it's Belle, and Belle is equally attracted to both Miles and, remember her name?
I'm now, of course, playing.
Many books ago.
Yes.
And Miles himself, who has brittle bone syndrome as a result of a chemical exposure, and he's in a culture that is very mutant aware because they had a lot of they had
So basically, the way that it works is that because it's a culture that's based on warrior culture,
Yes.
it's a culture that's very military. Miles is expected, because of his high place of birth, to still fulfill the duties of a male of his line. However, he has a disability. Miles's entire story is about breaking out of the mold
Yep.
and creating his own destiny. It's why I love Miles. It's why when I first read Miles, I basically went and started scribbling in my own notebook. Miles Borkosigan is one of the reasons I'm a writer. Because as a disabled kid sitting in my basement, it was the first time anybody was like me.
And it's one of the rare examples
Yes.
where the protagonist has a disability and it's done so well.
It's in fact one of the very few that I can think of, and I don't think any of them are in it, which is one of my biggest issues.
Well, I'm also sitting here thinking about the stereotype of the science fiction fan and the science fiction reader as someone who is, to one degree, is, well, I don't, disabled would not be the right word, but has some level of outsiderness, and that may well stem. I was a stereotypical sickly child. That's why I read all the time. But with the older works, say, other than Bujold, the move is always to get them over it. That somehow you're going to triumph over this adversity as opposed to being who you are.
Well, and that's
and
kind
living with it.
that's kind of why I was very much saying the identity is important, because a lot of what this is we want to fix it. We want to make it better. And so what I'm dying for, that's what I'm writing, is stories that talk about disability where it's an identity, where it's not needing to be fixed. Because we're talking about sort of fixing these issues, but being gay isn't a thing to be fixed. Being disabled isn't a thing to be fixed. Having a different colored skin isn't a thing to be fixed. So if those aren't things we need to fix, then why are those the problems we're solving in our books? And I guess that's the blind spot that I kind of saw. Also, by the way, I saw that I was on a panel called The Blind Spot, and I started laughing.
I do wonder if the people that had kind of got that, intended that little double twist, or even if it's just an accident.
Could be.
But it is an interesting little.
Do you have any candidates for a work of science fiction that you think does a particularly good job at doing?
I'd say sort of particular. I usually, when I'm asked like, what is your favorite or what's the best, I blank out. Best, but I'm just something that I was thinking in terms of actually. Sort of again, kind of micro-step, baby steps, kind of trying to maybe look 10 years, ahead. And I'm particularly, I guess, interested in sort of what the, internet doing to us, basically. And internet and I guess the sort of the increased, I wouldn't say competition necessarily, but it's sort of the culture of forces sort of vying for our attention, essentially. These kind of anonymous forces, such as corporations and what have you. It's a click culture, right? So, which creates this whole other sense of pressure and competition and exposure, and what it has on on society as a whole, and individuals as members of society. So I'm kind of interested in that. And what comes to my mind is actually George Saunders's short story that was published probably 10 years ago now in New York, which was called Come. I don't know if anybody read it.
Yeah.
But to me, it was one of those, oh, yes, for instance, this is what, I see it, how it could sort of happen, where it would go. And I think it was another story of his, which the name I forgot, which I read also, which was more of a, in terms of this kind of it was the the colony of kids who live to be targets of ads, advertising, or it's actually not good. I think it was George Saunders still, and I forgot the name. But these two pieces by this author were, for me, actually kind of revealing.
Well, thank you for referencing my favorite American short story.
Yes.
If you've not read George Saunders'
My
work, it
pleasure.
is absolutely astonishing. And he has his eye on things in a way that we're
Social
talking
terrorism.
about with the panel. Well, let me ask the opposite question. Is there works of science fiction that you could point to that you think do a particularly bad job of this? Or maybe to go back to this panel description, something that maybe does a great job on the technological side, but does what you think is a really egregiously lacking job in other words, a failure to pay attention to the sociological change that would go with the tech.
I tend not to read those stories.
Right, in a way, I would almost say that the most egregious examples are things that we don't read, that aren't remembered very much. Almost anything you pick up, like from the 30s or 40s, except for even some of the things that are still remembered as great, but anything that's not remembered as great is almost guaranteed to have hideously bad social notions, frozen in time, things that were probably already at the time outdated, cliched and bad. And so that seems to be one of the things that kind of eliminates a lot of works from being remembered very well, is that they have a terrible clash between imagining flying cars and whatnot, but everybody's got a wife who stays at home or whatever, and there's that just, or they got a little garage they park the flying car in, and a little yard, and isn't saying something about that. Of course, you can have some stories that would have part of the point, but if it just kind of default to things staying exactly the same or very similar in 500 years, we mostly got rid of it. But I think the interesting cases are a couple of things that I was thinking of while you guys were talking about. The tendency to treat things like disability, when they have been addressed, as things to fix, or as things to think about more as a way of overcoming. So you have things like Flowers for Algernon, right? Where that's what, it's, okay, yes, there you go. Where it's all about taking somebody who's got limited intelligence and bringing them up into superior intelligence, and then the sadness of watching them go back down in the view of the book, to having, it's not in any way about envisioning a world where variations of intelligence level would be accepted
forgive me for this. Flowers for Algernon, if you've read John Elder-Robis's most recent book, he talks about having a brain change on him. And suddenly he realizes he has empathy in a way that he didn't, and now what the hell do you do with it? He says it was really painful. I mean, this is the future coming and biting us hard. It's here, it's now. We really are doing Flowers for Algernon. And I'll shut up.
No, definitely. And that's, I think, one of the things is that there's no question that we're still, in reality, we're still treating these things mostly as things to fix, not as things to accept and include. And that's certainly a thing that I think the point of the panel, as Elsa was saying, is key, is that another one that, of course, the famous one, More Than Human, Sturgeon's story again, it's all about how somebody who is in one view of limited intelligence, when combined with other people, becomes this gestalt of super capacity. But it's not in any way about how did society change to make the condition of having limited intelligence to begin with acceptable, normal kind of function.
It just brought to mind something really I hadn't thought about in a while. So there's a wonderful series of young adult science fiction books called by Diane Duane, the So You Want to Be a Wizard series. And then she
You're hitting all our
wrote,
favorites.
one of the books she wrote was about an autistic wizard called A Wizard Alone. In her original publication of the book, they cure him with their ability to do magic in a science way, whatever it is. It's sort of science fantasy. but she got a lot of flack for it, and she rewrote the book and re-released it.
She did.
And I have to say kudos to her for doing that and creating a much more interesting story.
It's a beautiful rewrite.
It's a beautiful rewrite.
It really, it hit me right in the feels, as they say.
Yeah. Listening to Rob, what you were saying about Flowers for Algernon, I also think to go back to Robert A. Heinlein about a story like Waldo, where, again, there's a physical issue there, but the goal is to overcome it. And not to get too far off track, but that's also part and parcel of the 40s and really intensely in the 50s, this idea of within, at least American science fiction, Anglophone science fiction, of that the goal was to raise our brains to the highest
We can
possibility.
fix it.
We can
Technology
fix it, but we
fix
can
it.
also this fear of insanity, all of that.
Like science fiction and other things, I've almost thought of even what we would today call normative, as being the need of fixing.
Yeah,
Right? So we all needed to get to some super brain power, some kind of overmind to get over all the stuff that was wrong with us.
yeah. Go ahead. And then
Well,
there's a question.
It's interesting because, we're talking about all of this, but there's also, when you bring up the insanity thing, most of the works of H.P. Lovecraft are virtually unreadable for me now, because it's like I read these things and then I look at history and I read the big and I go, I can't do it. Like, those are the kinds of things that you can't look back at, almost. In that same way where it's like, yes, this is older, yes, the identity things have changed, and you're supposed to have horrors that can be sort of revisited, and in the future they can be revisited, and it's almost hard to do that.
No, Lovecraft is, Lovecraft, because Lovecraft. I mean, that is, and I very much admire Lovecraft's work, but it's a question of, not yes, but yes, and yes, here's the stories doing these things, and look at it.
Yeah.
I mean, that, and all of that is, you can't ignore either. Yes, please.
Well, it's funny because what you've been saying about Lovecraft actually extends the point of something. You said in the 40s in the 50s there's this idea of augmenting human power and so forth. And I think that's a big tendency in science fiction generally, is amplifying human capabilities either as a society or an individual. And that theme, I think, runs through a lot of it. It turns out, if you back up to Lovecraft, I mean, one of his big themes is gaining knowledge destroys you. The role-playing game called Cthulhu is explicit. Anything that increases your power decreases your sanity. But and I don't quite know how that's going to relate to the issues of disability, but if you sort of walk in with the assumption that humans, as they exist now, are highly disabled in many ways, the goal is to get over that. That's what a rocket ship is for, is to be able to get off this ball of dirt.
And along the way to kind of erase certain kinds of difference, because again, I don't want to beat up on More Than Human, because I still love that
Right.
book. But if you look at really three key science fiction novels from the 1950s, More Than Human, Childhood's End, The Star's My Destination, all prominently feature characters of color, and all of them really seem to want to just
Make it go away.
make it go away, not worry about it. I think that Clark in particular that wants to just not, why can't we all just get along and not worry?
I do want to address that, though. The knowledge and how that relates to disability, it does, because knowledge equals power. Power equals the knowledge to fix things. Power equals the power to make people fix things. And it's interesting that you bring up sort of the role-playing games thing, because that's another place that we're trying to fix these sorts of things for people. I'm a games designer, and I deal with that all the time. How do we balance this so that we're not just erasing identities left and right? We do. Well, this is why these conversations happen.
Right. I also wanted to come back to something you had said early on about being in the middle of huge social change, but not really yet being able to figure it out or to know what to make of it. And you talked about, networking and just the security state and all of that. And I was wondering if anybody else on the panel had any thoughts along those lines of, is there something that you see going on right now that you particularly feel that maybe earlier writers missed, or that we're not, or even contemporary work is not fully processing yet?
I think that we're in the midst of a time of very high anxiety. And if you look at a lot of the literature, particularly in the young adult literature, it's all dystopic. And I that's reflective of being in the midst of a time of unsettling change. And if you look at, like, if you go back to the 40s and 50s, it was a time of rapid technological growth and optimism. And so the science fiction of that era sort of portrayed that optimistic future. So I think we're actually going to see a lot more fiction of anxiety in the next decade. I don't know if that's good, bad, or indifferent, but I suspect that's...
It is.
The technology realm, and relating to that, Chuck Wendig's book Zeros does a really great job of showing things from the hacker side and technologically what people can do. And it's really interesting to me how that actually overlaps with identity. It overlaps with how you can use these technologies to benefit your identity, or how those technologies can come around and erase your identity. For example, I'm blind in this eye. I've been approached to have the bionic eye put in my head. In order to have the bionic eye put in my head, it has to have computer bits because it needs to be able to move around. And, you can use things with it. I don't want someone to be able to hack my eyeball. And that's an entirely possible future. No, thank you.
Yeah, well, that's, what was that movie, The Eyes of Laura Mars, only now it's a technical
Now
fix.
it's a tech part. Now it's a tech
Yeah.
part. I mean,
Yeah.
you can hack a pacemaker.
Yes.
Yeah, as people's cars, they
Yeah.
people there after.
Yeah, and one work I would toss out, and then I do want to be sure that we have time to open it up for questions, that was always a favorite of mine, but retroactively I think is in some ways even more interesting, is John Brunner's novel Stand on Zanzibar, which was published in 1968, takes place in the year 2010. On the one hand, really kind of, forecasts the contemporary sliding dystopia terrorist state that we currently inhabit. On the other hand, nothing seems to have changed much for women, certainly.
Yeah, this is a big thing.
Yeah, essentially, and again, this is another one of those yes and. Yes, it screws up, it doesn't, there's a failure of imagination about about gender roles, and it's still a spectacular book.
I'm
Because
a
it does
Shockwave Rider fan.
Shockwave Rider, oh, now that really did.
That is quite the book.
Yeah, and of course, and seeing how we can't help buying into the idea that on some level science fiction should predict the future, because we want it to, just like we want it to.
Well, I think we want it to be grappling with the possible future. I don't think we very much, at least not most of the time, want it to be predicting the minute details. It's very hard to do that, and that's important.
And
we
also,
definitely want to be riding the shockwave, like I was saying, we can, because the future is going to grow out of what's happening now, right? It's all like under the soil currently. And we want science fiction to be trying to pick up on the stirrings out of the worms and saying, what's going to bloom? And if you can get it right metaphorically, it's just that's what matters. You get the feel right. Like you want to capture something about that's what Stand on Zanzibar did right. Was he managed to catch certain things that were already going on way before most people had picked up on it, and forecast some actual things about our lives today. It wouldn't be in terms of exact, like he did not catch the design of the iPhones like that, but he captured the experience of living.
or even something like Neuromancer. I mean, never mind that none of those people seem to have families. But he got the feel of it very much. And of course, there's Bradbury's famous comment that science fiction writers are not supposed to predict the future, they're supposed to prevent it. Now,
All the surveillance.
He's right,
stuff.
certainly.
Yes, okay, I do want to make sure there's enough time for questions from the audience, so yes.
I just want to throw out Triton by Samuel Dillon. There's a lot of societal future vision and films.
Right, we didn't spend enough time, I think, on some of the things that have gotten some decent attention. I think some gender fluidity things, some sexuality things have actually gotten much better treatments than, say, disability things. So we didn't get, that's a great example. I think some of Melissa Scott's work in the 90s with homosexuality being very normalized and normalized. It was, in that sense, a bit of a vision of where we are close to being. So I think, yeah, I think that's great, especially the way I
We talked about the disability piece and not being included, I think, in the movies Readercon. There was still the plot of trying to cure the autism, but yet there was a place for him and other people with autism. And, from a mental health perspective, there's a book, I don't have the historical context, you guys have, so it's from 2005, Chris Donald and the book called Residence. But you have two people, one with OCD, labeled as OCD, and one with, some out-of-home hallucinations who their disabilities are actually what creates the solution for the issue that is going on at the time.
It's an interesting book. I've read it years ago, so I can't speak to it too closely, but it's an interesting book.
Sorry, I'm just sitting here being depressed at 2005. It was 100 years ago. Yes, yes.
I'm kind of reminded, I had an aunt who passed away a few years ago. She was almost 100 years old. And my son interviewed her before she died and asked her what was the piece of technology that made the biggest difference in her life. And he wanted her to say cell phone or whatever. And she said television was actually no big deal because she already had a radio. And the TV did nothing and the radio didn't do it. Having a phone made no difference. She immediately said, having a refrigerator in my house changed my life. And that happened to somebody who we weren't paying a lot of attention to, women at home. Now, she was a teacher, and she, this freed up hours from her day. So it happened to the wrong group of people to attract a lot of attention. And yet, it freed up a lot of time for her to be able to go on and do other things. Now, is there something like that that's happening now to people we're paying no attention to? But suddenly they've now got time or a resource or have lost a resource that just isn't capturing the imagination. And how does that, what that did in the future for her life, for everyone else's life? We may have missed that the whole time.
It's not so like sexy.
Yeah.
Okay, we have an
There's
response.
one book that you should look for. It's about women's work in the 1950s, and it specifically looks at the technology and how it changed women's work, specifically with laundry, vacuums, refrigerators. I can't remember the name right now, but if you find me during the con, I will look it up for you because it's in the appendix of the book I wrote.
In science fiction defense, I would say that there was an awful lot of attention paid to that kind of stuff, perhaps in a kind of a silly way, but in the 50s, right? You had, you had the robot vacuum cleaners and.
We had the Jets.
Right, the Jets. Maybe because it was only done so it's a silly way that we don't remember it very much as being focused. But for a little while, there wasn't a lot of attention to all the home stuff that
But we
was.
didn't pay attention to what happens when women have an extra 3 hours a day. to do
No, we're not looking at the social
Yeah.
implications,
Yeah.
definitely not.
The second
Because
part.
she was always just around
Yeah,
content, right?
Yeah, okay, please go ahead and then several more
The
questions.
second piece of my answer was, look at Twitter. Because Twitter is changing a lot of disabled activists' lives because they can now actually get involved in discussions that previously weren't open. My disabled community exploded when Twitter happened. Said, oh, you're at home and I'm at home. We all know each other now. So I think social media is kind of doing that.
Yeah, I'll also quickly throw out, I live in Vermont, but I'm originally from North Carolina. And I had a professor once who said that the true turning point in history itself was not the Civil War, it was the introduction of air conditioning. And that's true because it means the stores can stay open for a full 8-hour day. Question of that.
Well, just as an example, having lights that don't run on kerosene in Africa is probably a possibility for another candidate for that. that sort of thing. But my question was actually, I've always thought as a writer, it was like my responsibility not just to make the technology advance, but to completely build the world. I have to assume what that technology's impact is going to be on social structures. So that, just as 3 examples, when you have a first contact situation, you know there's got to be a schism in the monotheistic religions. If you have VR as a technology, you know people's social skills are going to go down the tubes. And you know if you have teleportation, you're going to get a lot more fatalistic or depressed people because they're going to have to keep voluntarily killing themselves.
Who thought that people would get bored with space travel? Yes, in the back.
On the point of VR, I just want to say that Pokemon Go is strongly encouraging pro-social behavior.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I wonder if you think there's a sense in which, in a lot of science fiction, regular people are invisible because, you know, they can't program computers, they can't be hackers, they can't fly starships, they can't do science. I don't know if there's a way to fix that and have science fiction be science fiction, but do you think that's part of, you know, what's built in? And is there a sense in which our society is actually becoming one in which people who can't do those things are going to be invisible?
The invisibility of the normal, or the unexceptional.
Well, as you said about neuromancer, right? Like no one has family. There's, you know, that's often kind of the solution to the problem, sort of, or a victim of the interest in the tech is that basic home life and stuff has often just been left out. No one worries about how marriage is working or how kids are being raised because nobody in this has any of that. And I think you're right, though, especially the question of the reality starting to reflect that thing. Is all the attention being paid to the people who, you know, making driverless cars?
If science fiction were truly predictive, it would be soap operas with technology. Because the reality is, in our day-to-day lives, how many of us really know how this device works? We just use it. We don't think about it. We don't create it. My kids don't know how a computer works. They just use it. It's like I didn't have to know how a telephone worked to be able to use it. And so those ordinary people, that's us using smartphones.
One of my favorite lesser-known science fiction stories is by the British writer Keith Roberts. It's called The Lordly Ones, and it's about a men's shirt attendant. After everything's fallen apart. Where are the Lordly Ones? Question you have?
Thank you for this amazing panel. I wanted to ask really quickly, so I'm of Pakistani and Dominican descent, but I'm also a Muslim American. And I'm an avid science fiction writer, but I'm very hard-pressed to find any really good post-9/11 novels that deal with the reality of being Muslim in America. And I know William Gibson has talked about 9/11 as a technological nodal point, a sociological nodal point. But his work still doesn't really address what it means, especially now. This is such an important issue that I feel science fiction can deal with. And I just wonder what your thoughts are.
Anybody got anything to offer on that? I would recommend, it's not really a science fiction novel, but just the work of a wonderful new young writer named Usman Malik.
Yes, I love his work. He's amazing.
You should read Usman.
But his stuff is more than,
You have to write it yourself.
I have to write it myself. You can buy it in the bookshop. It's called Technology, but I'm interested in other authors as well.
Well, tell us about to write one too, so.
Yes.
I would say it's a great example, though, because there are, like you point out, there are a few writers who are Muslims, but I can't think of any of them who are directly writing about that experience, the current problem. And that's maybe exactly what the thing was talking about. Is we don't do that enough about any of these things. Sort of look at right next to us, what's going on today.
Well, it's hard.
It's
just hard.
So it needs to be done, yeah. So we should, what's the name of your?
Technologies of the Self.
Okay.
Oh, okay, like the global self. Yeah, well, I think we're at least at the point of where people understand that you can't write a story that's plausibly set in a future that's populated by people named Smith and Jones. But that's a very tentative first step. You know, there's a lot more to be done. I'm very glad you brought up that point. it's an important one, and I
I don't
hope
think
that
like Ravi Timber, I don't think he, I read his book Osama, it's not really about that.
No.
So there are some people who write some books that maybe grapple with some of the issues of 9/11 differently from others, but it's not exactly addressing the question.
Yes, there
Being
was,
Muslim American.
okay, about you and then you, and I got the 5-minute sign 2 minutes ago, sir.
I was gonna say, someone brought up the missing normal people. And I thought that one of the problems that is within that is that the lack of people, in history of color or women or of disability is the implication, because science fiction is generally about the exceptional, or at least what we consider to be individuals in an exceptional situation or of an exceptional standing, and what they're doing is the implication that people in those groups can't be exceptional. I think that's one of the problems that has come of them being absent. And I guess it seems that something that just writers being aware of it and being conscious of it is one of the first steps to fixing it. Knowing that someone who can't hear can still do so many other things, and there's so many ways in which someone can be exceptional in science.
Right, I just got the stop sign. I'll just say that I predicted the future because I said we would have no trouble filling up this hour, and that has come to pass. You're welcome. Thank you. They're doing that because we want to.
So I have very strong opinions on reducing experimentation. So I actually been running a injury how to use
Somebody that's
It was 14 miles an
Last one, we could have
so it doesn't challenge them with people that are just likely to.
I would say that if we start from position that we are at
All right.
So I think it's just a avenue like VR inherently that allows people to interact with each other in a way that allows them to get this confrontation.
I think VR as it is in the world is inherently and I think the sort of hypothetical antisocial manifestation of VR will require some from no VR at all. The fact
thinking means that social interaction
Absolutely. Yes, I'm a journalist. And this is me. Moon cards are the best, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
I do too.
how does it affect then your ability